better roll them dice. You never know if it could change your life. Take a chance, you're neither wrong or right. You never know if you don't roll them dice. You better roll them dice. You never know if it could change your life.
Hello everyone, and welcome to a special bonus episode of Dungeon Master of None. I'm DM Rob, and today I'm going to be reviewing a book that I have been excited about for a long time, Coyote and Crow. Matt and I, have a lot of books that we have been meaning to review, and this one has fallen behind, and we have lots of others, so I'm just going to knock this one out because I'm really excited about it, and I've done a bunch of reading and already stolen some ideas and incorporated some things from this book. So I'm going to talk to you about it, and I'm going to tell you what's good about it, what you might be interested in as a GM, what kind of games it's good for, all that good stuff, whether or not this might be useful for you if you intend to incorporate things in your 5e games, or if you want to run something in the world of Coyote and Crow. But I think that this is, in brief, a great book, and there's a lot of really interesting stuff here. I hope you find this interesting because there's a lot to talk about, and it's different, I think, than a lot of what we normally talk about in some very interesting ways. So stay tuned, listen, and I hope that this is informative to you. So without further ado, let's talk about Coyote and Crow. So, in brief, what is Coyote and Crow? So the Coyote and Crow rulebook is the physical book's about 500 pages. There's also a PDF and some other books, but the core book has everything that you need to run the game as a GM, to learn it as a player. It is currently, I think it's about $60, maybe $25 for the PDF. I kickstarted it, so I don't actually know exactly how much it costs, but it costs what an RPG book costs, and it comes with everything that you would expect. It has information about the world, introduction to role-playing, character creation, GM notes. It has a whole bunch of bonus content and rules, and it comes with a starting adventure. And I'll talk about all of these elements in greater detail. It is a big, chonky book. It's beautiful. It is very nicely made. It has wonderful art, very unique, interesting art by a lot of different artists. It's very cool, very evocative. I really just love looking at it. And it is, like a lot of other books in this genre, it's a lot like the Pathfinder core rulebook. It's a lot like the Savage Worlds adventure book in that it has everything that you need in a single book. So it is a large book, and it is kind of unwieldy, but you aren't going to need to buy any supplemental materials to run a game in Coyote and Crow. So this is everything that you need, and you can get it from coyoteandcrow.net, and I'll link to it. But so what is it? What is Coyote and Crow? So let's delve into that a little bit. So Coyote and Crow was started out as a Kickstarter run by Connor Alexander in, March of 2021. It was funded in 45 minutes. It had over 16,000 backers and raised over $1 million. The pitch is a science fiction and fantasy tabletop RPG set in a near future where the Americas were never colonized, created by a team of natives, which is a great description of this book. Connor Alexander and a lot of his co-creators are native, indigenous to the United States and Canada and elsewhere, or have native backgrounds. A lot of the artists and playtesters, etc., are part of this community, and it very much shows in this book. So this was a very popular Kickstarter. It was, like I said, funded almost immediately. I kickstarted this, and I got my book, I think, late last year, and I have finally gotten around to talking about it. So, like I said, this is a nearly 500-page book. There's a lot going on here, but I'm going to try to cover what you need to know about this to see if you want to pick it up and hopefully give you some ideas for your own games. So what this is exactly what it sounds like. This is a whole role-playing game system and setting based around the idea of an Americas that was never colonized by Europe or by anyone else. And we'll talk about why that happened. And where the technology develops to futuristic levels, independent of any sort of European influence, which results in some very unique and interesting choices, I think, and presents a very cool and unique kind of world. So this is, an explicitly decolonial, anti-colonial project, right? This is not just positing a world where Native Americans fight back against the Europeans, but where European colonization never happens. And this is a really terrific and interesting thought experiment, I think, and this goes a lot of really interesting places with it. If you're a fan of the Kim Stanley Robinson book, Years of Rice and Salt, it's a similar sort of thought experiment explanation. This goes a little bit more wild with it, and I think it's just sort of like a fun and interesting idea to explore, an interesting world to participate in. The general vibe, the general aesthetic and feel is something that I would describe as native futurism, indigeno futurism. If you're familiar with Afrofuturism, the works of, well, she would say African futurism, Nnedi Okorafor, or parts of Octavia Butler's work, or any of the artistic or musical or design elements of the Afrofuturism movement. This is very similar, except based around indigenous style and art, especially of the Americas, rather than African American or African influences. And I think that's really cool. You should, if nothing else, Google this book and take a look at the art that's on the cover. It's really cool. It has a couple of native looking characters with sick, nasty, floating swords and augmentations and really like awesome outfits. If your players like to look cool and they like to wear colorful clothes and are very interested in what their players are dressed like, what their characters are dressed like, or what their hairstyles are, that sort of thing, this is a great RPG for that. This encourages style and creativity when it comes to how you dress and present yourself. So that's sort of like the big picture of this. Just to imagine yourself a futuristic world set in North America where it was never colonized by Europeans. The book, I should be upfront, can be a little confrontational sometimes. There's different sections for natives and non-natives, and non-natives are explicitly told, please do not appropriate native imagery. If you're not native yourself, avoid using native faiths or native names or trying to speak like somebody who's a Native American. And I think this is entirely fair. I think this is a very reasonable thing for a indigenous or native creator to say, but some people might find it a little bit off-putting, I suppose. There's even a blog post on the Coyote and Crow website that says, hey, white people can play Coyote and Crow, just be respectful, which is exactly how you should approach this. So just be aware that if you're not native, that you should be careful about how you conduct yourself, but you are encouraged to play it, and the native creators who are involved in it want you to. You should be respectful about it. Okay, so that's the big picture. So let's talk about what's in Coyote and Crow. So there's basic stuff about role-playing and how you approach that, and it's fine. It's nothing unique. But before long, we get into the world, and the world is called Makasing. Sometimes the Americas are referred to as Turtle Island, which is a traditional name for the region. But Makasing is what basically the North American continent is referred to throughout the book, and the center of the sort of like gameplay, or the focal point of the region and gameplay, is Cahokia, which is a traditional and historical site on the Mississippi, kind of where St. Louis is today, where some really tremendously large mounds were built by people who we no longer are entirely sure who they were. what they spoke, what sort of groups they belonged to. But they had a large civilization in Cahokia and a substantial urban population there. And so Coyote and Crow is built sort of around the idea that Cahokia is still there, and it has now grown and expanded and advanced into the future. So the book focuses largely on Makasing, and there are 5 nations in Makasing that sort of like map onto there's the Hatsawani, which are sort of like the Iroquois Confederacy. There's the Dene Confederation, which is Navajo. There's Isquak, which are Pacific Northwest tribes. And then there's a couple of other confederations. There's also information on the Ezcan Empire, which are more or less the Aztecs, and some other empires nearby. But what's cool about this is that all of the words in Coyote and Crow, or all of the non-English words, are in something called Chahi, which is basically a conlang, a fake language, or a made-up language that they made just for Coyote and Crow. And it's not like a full conlang. You can't, there's not an entire vocabulary for you to speak in, but there's a whole bunch of words, and they're based, what it seems like, around some real indigenous languages. I think the author said that it was based on the Métis sort of Creole speak that was common in Canada. And so every person, every place, most objects have a Chahi name as well as an English word that relates to that, which I think is really neat. And it's a lot of detail, and it helps, I think, ground you in the game and the setting and the location. So a bit more about the setting. So, I mentioned that Makasing, North America in Coyote and Crow, was never settled by any Europeans, and that is because around 1400 in our timeline, the world is plunged into darkness by something called Awis, the darkest night. And there's a bunch of stories about this. The Great Spirit went away. There was a comet, blah, blah, blah. It's not super important what happened, but the world was plunged into darkness. The days and nights grew colder. Agriculture suffered. The glaciers moved in, and lots of basically all around the world, everybody was sort of forced to retreat back into just small communities and try to focus on survival. So at the time of the game, this is a few hundred years in the past, and people have recovered and are rebuilding and growing and inventing, and it's a boom time. There's still what are called the frozen lands north of Makasing, which can be explored, and the North American continent is still cut off from Europe and Africa and Asia, though they are aware of those places. It is still difficult for some reason, unclear, to travel to those places, but they're aware of them. And so there's a lot of interesting things about this sort of idea. And one of the interesting ones, or one of the most interesting parts about this, I think, is the way that the author and the authors have thought about the technological implications of this difference, right? The fact that Europeans never colonized North America, because explicitly this is a future setting, a science fiction setting, and so there's futuristic technology, but there's some notable exceptions, right? There's no alcohol, there's no wheels, right? The wheel is never really developed historically in North America and South America, even though the native people of those continents were aware of how wheels worked, because a lot of travel took place on rivers, and it was just not as necessary. One might suggest that it would have emerged eventually, but in the world of Coyote and Crow, they just sort of skipped over wheels entirely. Now, most travel over land takes place either by foot or on trained animals, or by hovercraft or skimmers or low-flying machines, which I think makes a ton of sense. There's no wheat, right? Wheat was not cultivated in North America. Everybody eats mostly maize. There's no fossil fuels because they didn't need to develop them the same way that they did in Europe. There are no gunpowder-fueled firearms, though there are different forms of projectile weaponry, a bunch of little things like this. And I think this is very, very interesting, and I think this is well thought out. And it's worth bringing up that you might just need to think about this. It's something that might trip up your players. You know, there are still the equivalent of bars where people can go and get a tasty drink, maybe engage in some recreational drug use, but they don't have booze. They don't have beer or alcohol. And I think that makes sense. And, you know, if they're hopping a transport to the next town over, they're not going to be getting in a Jeep. They're going to be hopping on a Yutsu skimmer or something like that. And these are small things, but I think when I was reading it, it really made me think about what my sort of baseline priors were and sort of like what technology is. And I really appreciate the insight that it gave me on this. I thought it was really thoughtful. Now, you might disagree with certain things, and one wonders sort of like about how technology would actually develop and whether or not these things might eventually come everywhere sooner or later. But I like the idea, and I think it's supported that a North American continent that develops independent of Europe but achieves a futuristic technological level would have fantastic science fiction-y devices, but not necessarily, you know, fast cars or vodka. So that's just something that you're going to want to think about and read up on and bear in mind. So that's one of the big changes. There's also, in addition to the Awis and all of these things that happened during the Darkest Night, sometime after that, these purple marks started to appear on plants and animals, the Adanati, which is something like is the gift. And this purple substance could be harvested and ingested by humans to develop abilities, basically. And so this gives around 15 to 20% of the population a chance to develop various abilities. And the abilities are things like eyes of the eagle and strength of the bear. And sorry, I'm saying that like I'm, you know, making fun of it, but it's actually pretty cool. And they're all related to the animal or the plant or the source of the Adanati. And they are based on various sort of like natural or animal aspects. And they grant everything from stat bonuses to, you know, more interesting things. And I'll go into greater detail on those later when I talk about the system. But basically this means that there's a world of highly sophisticated cities and people with some pseudo-mystical powers as well as advanced technology. And this creates, I think, some really, really interesting adventuring and GMing situations. There's also, as a part of all of these changes, something called the Black. And the Black is it's a little bit like the Upside Down from Stranger Things, right? It's a parallel or nearby dimension that people can pass through, they can astral project into, they can explore. It has some real life analogs. It's very ambiguous, it's unclear, it doesn't relate exactly to the real world, but it has a lot of potential information, and it's useful for, you can travel through it or you can project your consciousness into it. And this becomes important later when we're talking about factions and abilities, but just one interesting element of the world. So the book talks about Makasing, it talks about the Five Nations, and it talks about sort of the world in general, the Adanati, but it spends a huge amount of time talking about Cahokia itself, and it has a big, beautiful map, and it goes through everything. It goes through all the districts, how it's governed, who the organizations are, who the people are, the culture, the food, life, entertainment, communication, everything. Like everything that you could ever possibly want to know about society and culture in Cahokia, it is in this book. I love this. I know that you've probably heard me talk about how much I like city campaigns before. This is so awesome. It gives you all of the tools that you would need to run any campaign that you wanted, but especially if you wanted to use Cahokia as a starting point or a hub, it's all there. Plus, Cahokia is a really interesting starting point or hub. There's a lot of going on there. There's a lot of different factions. The Cahokia and sort of like the free lands are a loose confederation, and so even compared to the Haudenosaunee, there we go, Haudenosaunee, It's open, it's free. There's a lot of innovation and invention and chances for exploration and breaking out of the mold. I could go on all day about like what's actually in here, but a couple of other relevant things in the world section. Again, I'm not going to be able to cover this all, and I don't want to because we'd be here all day. But there isn't money in the same sense that we think of it. Most things are provided for everybody for a variety of reasons that I'll get to in a second. But there is something called Nidzi, which is kind of abstracted money. They're, various tokens of exchange, and you have sort of like a Nidzi level. This is a bit like how Burning Wheel does it. You sort of have a wealth level, and you can more or less afford everything that you have enough sort of like Nidzi level for. I like this. I think this is a really good system. I also, because I hate tracking things, and I think it's very fiddly. So this is pretty cool. The technology, there's a couple of like unique technologies that I think are really interesting. So as part of their exploration into Aranati, the people of Makasing discovered something called Yutsu, which is basically like hovercraft, anti-grav technology. And so there's Yutsu elevators and Yutsu skimmers and, low-flying machines. Everybody has, or most people have, something called second eyes, which are basically like AR glasses. And this was a really interesting touch, I thought. They're not designed to replicate real life, and according to the book, the people of Makasing would think that's kind of weird. So they're intended to, again, like AR, overlay some artistic and abstracted symbols to provide information and to be used in the same way that we'd think of VR or AR goggles, but they're not meant to replace the real world. That is not the intent of these second eyes. There's also a technology called GATS, and GATS are basically just big 3D printers, replication machines. So this is why money isn't a huge deal. Everybody has clothes and food and basic shelter, and for the most part, in the prosperous parts of Makasing, everybody is fine for basic necessities. Above and beyond that, though, there is plenty of trade and commerce and entrepreneurship, but nobody really has to worry about the basics. Everybody also has something called a Nisi, which is like a comlink. It's a little band you wear on your arm that allows you to communicate and talk to people and interface with the Daso, which is basically like the web, the internet. So a lot of things are like any other sort of cyberpunk or science fiction game. You've got, the basics, the comlinks, the internet, the so on and so forth. There's also cybernetics, right? If you lose an arm or an eye or whatever, you can get it replaced. But, and this is also, I think, a really interesting touch. The people of Makasing don't replace their limbs or their, various things that they need to recoup with direct approximations. The book states they think that's kind of weird. They tend to favor artistic or beautiful, abstracted limbs if they need to replace one. It also points out, and I liked this, I thought this was a good point, that a lot of people just don't, there's not as much pressure or impetus to, if you lose a hand or an arm or something else or an eye, to replace it. If you feel that you can live, then there's not always a feeling that it must be replaced with a cybernetic replacement, because everybody's doing okay and there's not as much pressure to be useful or productive, right? This is a continent that has never felt the pain of the Protestant work ethic. And I once again, this breaks my brain a little bit, and I'm not sure exactly how it would play out, but I think it makes sense. And so this is interesting. So there are cybernetics and there are enhancements that your players can install or invest in, but it's not as widespread as it would be in Cyberpunk or Shadowrun or something like that. There's also there's an interesting question about, does magic exist? There's the Aranati, which is this weird mystical substance, and there are mentions of certain deities and gods or godlike creatures, spirits. But I think the book does a really good job of never answering the question, are these things magical, right? There's that Arthur C. Clarke quote, right? Sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. And I think this book really does a good job of towing the line. It specifically addresses this point. So I think you can decide as GM, is there magic? Are these people magical, etc.? And I think that's a really like fun, open question to have. So I've described the world, and there's got a whole lot of detail that I have not gone into. The section on the world is deep and involved and is worth reading all by itself. But I don't want to make it sound like it is some kind of native indigenous utopia. The writers were careful to make it seem, again, follow sort of like the threads. In many ways, this is superior to and much more egalitarian than the world that we live in, but it is not a perfect utopia. There are still murders, there are still crimes, there are still wars, there is still pain and hunger and suffering. And I think they really did a good job of creating a fantastic future world that you want to play in, but one that still has enough intrigue and conflict that it's worth doing so. So this is, in my opinion, the real strength of the book. The setting is unique and interesting. The art is amazing. The ideas are fantastic and incredible. I think there's just so much going on here and so much to draw from. So this alone makes the book worth getting. But let me talk about the second couple parts. So this does also come with a unique system. And obviously you don't have to use the Coyote and Crow system. You could take the setting and port it over, and I'll talk about my thoughts on that in a bit. But the setting as it exists is a D12 based system, and it works a lot like Shadowrun does with D6s. You put together a dice pool of your stats and your skills, you roll to hit a certain target number, and you count successes, and then based on the number of successes that you have, you determine the effectiveness of your actions. So basically everything is a skill or stat check in that way, much the way that almost everything in Shadowrun is a skill or stat check, which makes it very, very simple and straightforward. There are 9 stats divided into physical, mental, and spiritual, and there are 28 skills. So each skill has 2 related stats. I like this a lot, actually. So if you have a skill and one of your stats is higher, you can be somebody who's good at athletics, but you use your dexterity instead of your strength. And every skill has something like this. I think this is a nice touch. There are 3 derived stats, body, mind, and soul, which are based on sort of the sum of your physical, mental, and spiritual stats. I like this too. It's a little bit more to keep track of. It means that you've got to, but it means that something can target your body, your mind, or your soul. And I think this is a nice touch. I think this is interesting, and also opens up enemies and monsters and whatnot to do more than just a wonk on your PCs. So I want to be clear, I've not tested any of this, and there are some parts of it that I do sort of like wonder about how mechanically it will work. But in general, I think it's a pretty neat system, and I think it should work just fine. There's gifts and burdens that your players can get, which are boons and sort of like flaws and advantages to boost them up at character creation. There's a bunch of neat gear and weapons, of course, and this is cool, right? There's knives and clubs, but like space knives and clubs, like cyber knives and clubs, which is cool. But there's also like mag slings, which are like little rail guns that fire metallic slugs, cyber bows, all kinds of like neat shit, and a bunch of cool armor and outfits, little gadgets and gizmos, everything you would expect from a science fiction cyberpunk style game, but kind of, again, indigenous, native inspired. Your players have primary and secondary actions. There's initiative. This is going to be pretty familiar to players of D&D, but especially to players of maybe Savage Worlds or Shadowrun. Like I said, I think the system works pretty well. I haven't tested it, so I can't necessarily recommend it to you. I will say on my first read through, I wasn't thrilled. On my second, I kind of liked it more. I don't think that there would be anything wrong with porting this over to Savage Worlds, or even if you wanted to do a little extra legwork, 5th edition, and sticking with the setting. I think, in fact, it would be very easy to do so. But I think that it would be worth giving the system that's been provided a shot. I don't think, I will say, that there's any... The system and the setting don't work together sort of synchronistically the way that I sometimes like. They also don't they're not in opposition to each other, so there's not really any reason, not any strong arguments that I can see for or against using the system that's provided. You might as well, just because it's kind of straightforward, unless you want to do a little extra legwork. So those are the two main parts, and then there's sections for the GM, and the GM section has what you would expect: rules on GMing, different types of encounters. This is cool. Again, this is not unique. Pathfinder has this, lots of games have this, but encounters are divided into things like social and combat, exploration, etc. And there's good examples and neat rules for different types of encounters. If it's not clear from what I've been describing, this is a combat game, or there is combat in this game, but I think it will be more satisfying to run a game that includes intrigue and politics, investigation, exploration. It is not combat focused. It is not heavily tactical, right? It's not a tactical RPG. And the GM section includes a lot of cool suggestions and rules for how to run these encounters and how to approach them. The game is divided into sort of narrative play and encounters, which I think is a perfectly great way to divide up your role-playing sessions. Either you are sort of in a narrative moment, or you are in a time-bound specific scene or encounter. The book suggests that you sort of divide your gameplay into stories, and then stories are part of sagas, so basically individual sessions and larger campaigns. There's some really cool examples of different types of games you can run. One of the ones they recommend, and this is really interesting, the free lands in Cahokia have these people called Suyata, which are marshals or judges, investigators. I would call them secret police, but that has a bunch of connotations that I don't mean to imply. But they're enforcers of a type, but it makes, I think, for a very interesting, both for interesting antagonists and also for protagonists. And the book recommends that you run one of your campaigns, or run your first campaign where all the players are Suyatas, which makes sense because they would all know each other, they would have a reason to work together, and it allows for some really interesting types of adventures. And I actually think this is a really good idea. There's also suggestions for running a protection style campaign where you are looking after a person or a location or a holy site. Exploration. A horror is actually a really interesting one in this setting. There's a lot of really spooky ass monsters in indigenous tradition, and there's a lot that are included in this book, and running a horror campaign I think could work really, really well in Coyote and Crow. It also introduces something that the GM section doesn't have anything groundbreaking. It's definitely worth reading, but they did have something that I really liked, just sort of this brief idea called the 3-path concept, which was just suggesting that when you lay out a scenario for your players, you sort of sketch out 3 different paths that they might take. And I realized this is kind of how I subconsciously run my games. When I present my players with a conundrum or a dilemma, or give them a series of next steps, I'm always thinking in 3s. And maybe that's just because 3s are easy to think in. But I have sort of 3 possible outcomes. And I think that this is a huge assumption, I have no idea, but that most people tend to think in binaries. Players will do one or the other. But I think just adding a 3rd path, trying to think through at least 3 different options, is a great way to make sure that you're not caught off guard and just sort of plan encounters as a GM. So I thought this was really, really neat. So the last few things that are in the GM section of the book are, there's icons and legends, which is basically a list of NPCs, factions, and faiths. And boy, did I really like this section. There are so many cool things in here. There's secret societies, there's death cults, there's purple Adenati zombies, there's secret hidden nihilists that have infiltrated the societies of Makasing and are trying to end the world. There's monsters that have followed people back from the black. There's serial killers with strange powers. There's monstrous beasts from ancient legend. I would love for them to do this like in greater detail. I would pay for, 10 times as much. It's so cool. This was such a cool section. So many cool ideas for this game and for others. Yeah, just awesome stuff in the final section. And then there's a starting adventure, which I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about in case you want to run it or your players want to play in it. But it's basically just you go to a place and you investigate a mystery. It's got a great combination of social, combat, exploration, lots of cool NPCs. Matt and I have mentioned at length that every core book should have a starting adventure, and check that box. This is a good one. It's great. So yeah, that's Coyote and Crow. That's the main part of it. There's additional resources on the website, including, this is neat, there's a little like Chahi name generator. There's a Chahi glossary. There's a couple of like rules light or introductory PDFs that you can download. So if you're curious about this, I would go to the website and check it out. But this book has, like I said, it has everything that you could conceivably want to run and play a game of Coyote and Crow. If this at all sounds interesting to you, you should pick it up. I think this is a really interesting book. It gave me a ton of ideas. I don't know if I am going to ever have time to run a game specifically in the world of Coyote and Crow, but I would like to, and maybe someday I will, but I'm absolutely going to steal ideas from this. It also, it's beautiful. It's interesting. I just found this very, very compelling to read. It was a great book, and it really covered all the things that I'm looking for in an RPG book. So if you're curious about it, I would go to the website and check it out. If you think that this is at all interesting to you or your players, you should check it out. If you are one of our listeners and you are a native player or a native GM, you should absolutely get this. It was written for you. And I think you would undoubtedly find it very, very interesting and it very compelling to play a game in this setting. So I hope I've done a good job of telling you what this is about and pitching this to you. I was really happy to have kickstarted this. It was a delight to finally get the book. I am really looking forward to seeing what Connor Alexander and the Coyote and Crow team do. I know they have another Kickstarter that either just wrapped and they have some other things that are going on. So these are definitely some people to keep an eye on. So that's my review of Coyote and Crow. I don't know, maybe A+, A-. I don't know. It fits somewhere in that A zone. It's great. Take a look at it. See if it's interesting. Check it out. Let us know what you think. And as always, thanks for listening. Stay healthy, stay safe, and keep rolling them dice.
You better roll them dice. You never know if it could change your life. Take a chance, you're neither wrong or right. You never know if you don't roll them dice. You better roll them dice. You never know if it'll change your life. Take a chance, you're neither wrong or right. You never know.